Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. What's wrong with our approach to gender equality in the workplace? That might seem provocative, and don't get me wrong, we've come a long way, even since 2010, when a government review found that nearly half of FTSE 250 companies lacked a single woman in the boardroom. Today, you'll look at the same companies and you do see women in senior positions. Still only 10 CEOs though. This is despite women and girls outperforming men and boys academically and often in the workplace too. So what's going on? Well, fellas, it might be time for us to pick up the mantle ourselves. My guest today is Daniele Fiandaca, founder of Token Man, an organisation with the mission to create more inclusive workplaces through empowering men. A topic very close to my heart. I'm really looking forward to this one. Daniele, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob. I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
So, Daniele, if you are a little bit radical and you're on this podcast, so we know you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
Wow. Now that's a question. Listen, I'm sure everyone says the same thing. Their parents, they gave me the space, I think, to go and learn who I am and be myself. I think part of that actually has to be, I did go to boarding school.
Oh, interesting.
8 to 11. I had a heart-to-heart with my mum not so long ago, and she talked about how it broke her heart that when we came home, that we couldn't wait to go back to school. You know, I was very lucky. I had an amazing school life. I absolutely loved being a boarder. I never had that kind of attachment. You know, my dad's an Italian immigrant. I didn't see a lot of my parents growing up, actually, because we had nannies most of the time growing up, because both my parents worked very hard to put us into the private schools they did put us in. So obviously thankful of the things they did. So that meant when I was 18, the first thing I did was take a gap year, went travelling, worked for 6 months in Italy. You know, my first paycheck I gave to my dad, just because I was so thankful for everything they did for me. I think I was just brought up watching my parents do everything, literally everything for me. And I was very grateful and thankful for it. And I think that just set me up on a path where, you know, I worked really hard. You know, in my 6 months off, at one point I had 4 jobs. 2 weeks I did 100 hours each week. I mean, it's just, you know, I don't know how I had the energy for it. My mum's an artist. I think that's where I've been very lucky in that I have, you know, some people have said I'm the most left brain, right brain thinkers they've ever met. I'm a qualified chartered accountant who has also won a Cannes Lion, a gold Cannes Lion. Cannes Lion is basically the Oscars of the advertising world. So I don't think there are many accountants who've also won a Cannes Lion. So
none that I know either. You're the first I've met, Daniele, definitely.
I think having that freedom to be who I could be and actually following the example of my parents, I think really put me in a good place.
How do you view work now? Because clearly you were looking at your parents sometimes from afar, literally in physical distance as well as emotional distance, for one of a better word. How do you look at that now in your relationship with work? Do you still have the same commitment and persistence and drive, or has that changed over time?
I've always been ambitious and always had a drive. I think it's different for me simply because I don't have children. You know, their purpose was really us as kids. I think I've still got that same drive, but my purpose now is inclusion and diversity and creating change. So for me, I still have that purpose and I still have that drive, but also I think I'm probably a bit more balanced. I actually know I can go down rabbit holes. You know, it's really interesting. We went into lockdown. My creative brain went into overdrive. My finding ways to solve problems went into overdrive. So, you know, give you some very good examples. Firstly, I launched the virtual movie night the first day we went into lockdown. So for the first 60 nights, I curated 60 movies. We watched at 8 o'clock every night, and we hosted a Zoom for other people that found us. Now, I'm very proud we were listed as Time Out's top 13 virtual movie clubs across the UK. And at the same time, I had a business that had lost 100% of its income. All of it, everything.
Wow.
We did everything in person. We had never delivered a workshop online.
And was that Token Man, or was that a different business?
That was something called Utopia. So it was Utopia. It's a culture change business. It still exists. It's absolutely brilliant. I found it with Nadia Powell, and it's also run with Tolo Ferrinto. And also my wife, Tina, also works there. So when I left last year, she stayed. But, you know, we lost everything. But within 2 weeks, we launched a virtual summit. And when we launched it, we still hadn't delivered a single thing online. I've actually written a number of books in my life. I'm very privileged, but one of them is Creative Superpowers. I'm showing it to you. I know no one else can see it.
Yes,
but
Daniele is holding up a bright yellow book with very nice typography on it.
Within that book, Scott Morrison, one of my co-editors, he did the teaching section, and we'd been using it a lot. Alvin Toffler talks about the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write. They will be those that cannot learn, unlearn and relearn. And the minute we went into lockdown, the minute we lost all our income, that learn, unlearn and relearn, we focused everything on those three words. So what do we need to do to learn, unlearn and relearn in this world? And so when we launched that conference, some people said, you're mad. How can you do this? You've never run it online. We're like, well, it has to work. For us, it was just really simple. It just had to work because it was the only way we were going to survive as a business. So it just so happened we were very lucky. Now, if I look at my balance of work, I do 50% virtual, still 50% in person. So all of a sudden, I've got this accessibility to the work that I do that I never had before. So, again, been very lucky.
It's good to acknowledge the luck. You've talked about your approach to work as you've got older, but what about being radical? Do you think you've got more radical as you've got older or less? And what's been behind that?
I think for me, it's really interesting. I'm going to go back to another book that I did, which is called The Best Piece of Advice Ever. Sam Ball, who works in the advertising industry, said, if you haven't shat yourself in the last 12 months, you're not trying hard enough. And to a certain extent, I think he's right in that, have you done something that actually you're like, oh, I'm not sure I should do this. So 8 or 9 years ago, and it's still online, I did a panel with the RSA, and it had the founder of the Foresight Society, it had the author of Lean Out, and then it had me who'd only really started Token Man 6 months earlier, who still knew hardly anything. I was absolutely bricking it, but I did it. And what was interesting is things happened as a result of me doing that. Firstly, what was lovely is I had 5 women come up to me afterwards and say, thank you, that's the first time I've heard something original in the last 3 years around this topic. And that wasn't me being super clever, it was me being a white straight man talking about it, because there weren't any white straight men talking about it. So I just came up from a different angle. So for them, it was refreshing. It gave them a different perspective. And that's why diversity is so important, having those different voices. But secondly, a lovely man called Hilary Gallo came up to me and he said to me, hi, my name's Hilary. I'd like to give you this. And he gave me his book, The Power of Soft. And he said, I think you've got the power of soft. And I just wanted to gift it to you. Hilary next week is one of the coaches and one of the programs I'm running. So firstly, what I have learned is through putting yourself out there, through stepping forward, stuff happens. Okay, it really happens. And I would argue, me saying that, if you look at everything that I'm talking about right now, engaging men in I&D is the secret for us creating change. I don't think that's radical. That's just logical. It just so happens that not everyone necessarily sees it in the same way that I see it. And then the nice thing is that I have seen it work. Engaging men is so important when you talk about inclusion and diversity. No minority in history has ever affected change without the support of the majority. And while women clearly aren't in the minority, unfortunately they are in senior positions in leadership. And so for me, unless we engage those men in helping create that change, we're not going to make the change. But I think what's really interesting, if you go back to 9 years ago when I started Token Man, I knew that what I was doing was radical. The first thing that I did was, okay, this cannot be a man trying to create a change in an echo chamber. I can't be the man on the shining horse that has no context or doesn't understand it. So the first thing I did is my 3 co-founders were women. Yeah, so for me, I had to have that kind of, it was partly a safety net, but also that kind of confidence that I'm doing the right thing, I'm saying the right things, that actually it will connect equally with women as it would men. And what was really interesting, Emma Perkins, who's one of our co-founders, she said to me, are you sure you want to do this? And I said, yeah, why? She goes, because I just think you're going to get a huge backlash. And I said, okay, that's interesting.
And have you?
She said, I said, who from? And she said, from men. And actually in my head, I had been worrying, but I'd been worried about women. And I said, if it's from men, I don't really care.
You can handle that.
Yeah, I can handle that. And secondly, you can't make an omelette without breaking egg. There has to be an element of which you go, do you know what? Not everyone's going to agree. I was worried about women because if women didn't want this in the space, how could I exist? And actually having to defend yourself against that was something that's much harder as a man. Go back to your point, have I? Generally, the answer is no. But I actually think that's partly a challenge of my profile. I know quite a lot of men in this space whose profile is higher, and they are getting backlash, from men. And sometimes that can be extremely unpleasant. I still will get some women looking at me and I know, okay, you just don't resonate with what I'm saying at all. And that's fine. And I understand that. I think even now when I talk about the need to have empathy for men and the journey they need to go on, I think some women find that very hard to hear or listen and go, men have had it easy. And I understand that often they're coming from a place of hurt. My job ultimately is I'm on this path to engage men because I know it will help women and other historically marginalised groups.
I want to go back on a couple of things you said, Daniele. So one thing that struck me in that story of your first sort of appearance as the face of Token Man is that I think you did use the white privileged straight male superpower, which is being able to do something that you, by your own admission, didn't know much about, wasn't particularly, confident of, but did it anyway. And I think that is something that we tend to have more of as straight, white, privileged males, is just that confidence to do something that we're not 100% certain of. And I kind of love it that you're using that to progress gender equality, right? And we need more of that energy to progress on a number of issues, which are adversely affecting our world. Do you recognise that?
Go back 8-9 years ago, privilege for me, it was not seen in the same way I see privilege now, right? I think for me, you're 100% right. I mean, I've had to reflect on some things that maybe I've talked about, but I'm like, I've got no right to talk about those things, right? So for me, it's about understanding where you sit. A lot of the time, I'm talking about my lived experience. Increasingly now, obviously 9 years in, I'm able to talk about lots of men's experiences. I'm able to talk about the journey I've gone on, but also the journey through the men that I work closely with have gone on. But I think what was really important, again, going back 9 years ago, I actually think 9 years ago, I think I did get it right. The reason we started Token Man partly was because someone asked me to speak at a conference. And I said, no, I cannot speak at a conference. I don't know anything about this. This would be me being that privileged white man who thinks they've got a point of view without actually having any of the knowledge. What's interesting for me is I recognised it. I also knew how charged this space is. So I actually think it was partly protective. I think there's other subjects, but without being someone that really understood it, if someone asked me to, I'd be, yeah, of course I will. Last year, to be honest, I contributed a piece around fatherhood and fathers, and when it came out, I regretted it, because what I should have done is I should have passed it over to either Elliot Ray or Hanson Lee, who do it every day. Listen, I turn down work the whole time. I do get asked to talk about inclusion, equity and diversity, and I'm really clear. I said, why are you getting me to talk? They just want a speaker to talk about it generally. And I said, well, don't get me to speak about it. There are people more diverse with better lived experiences that can tell a better story than me. If you need me to connect with people that look like me, then that's a conversation that I would love to have a talk. But beyond that, I can recommend 5 other speakers who come from historically marginalised groups who need to be speaking rather than me.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing that, Daniele. So, Daniele, we're going to move on to your work now. We've heard about the founding of Token Man and what the mission is from that first section there. But what is your work now on a daily basis with Token Man? What does Token Man do, and how are you trying to make that impact?
I basically have 2 hats, Token Man and Token Man Consulting. So both are driving change. Token Man Consulting is I get paid for. So Token Man is really focused on engaging more men through content, using a framework that I use for both Token Man and Token Man Consulting, which is support, inspire and recruit. So we do 3 things for men. We support them by giving them content. So for example, we did a panel earlier this year called Being a Father in the Workplace. That was all about support. That was getting them to understand how they could be better fathers, what support they could do, what support they could give each other. Then you've got Inspire. Inspire is looking at, okay, what are the skills that men need to really foster, to build? So a good example, in February next year, we're doing the power of vulnerability. So looking really deeply at vulnerability, what vulnerability should be. And thirdly, we've got recruits, where we're looking at male allies and agents of change. So we've done panels on allyship and being an agent of change, for example. There's a lot of content, and we have Masculinity Workplaces, our annual event that we do every year, which is specifically designed to engage men with inclusion and diversity. And Token Man, we're also building tools, we're doing research. So that's the kind of Token Man hat. Then the Token Man Consulting is where I work with corporates. So with corporates, I do 2 sets of work really. One is inclusive leadership, so working with their senior leaders to help them become more inclusive. So that can either be at a team level or at individual levels. So that will include content as well as coaching. And then the other half is actually working with clients to set out their engaging men strategy within their I&D strategy, and then support that. So support that in terms of some of the delivery of that strategy.
This might be a bit of a basic question, but what is an ally?
It's not a basic question, actually, because I do allyship training and I use a slightly different definition. So firstly, if you look at the dictionary definition, an ally is someone that helps historically marginalised groups fundamentally, and provides them support and helps them at so many different levels. The thing that I would tend to add to that is I try and go beyond that definition to talk about allyship being better allies to everyone. I think men need to be better allies to other men, either through intersectionality. So it might be a white man being better ally to a black man or a gay man, but also it could be just someone that's a father or a friend that's really struggling. But I think the other adjuncts that I add to that, and even though I kind of take people on allies and agents of change, I think an ally also needs to be someone that fundamentally is thinking about the system. So as I said, it's the systems are broken. So for me, an ally someone that understands it's the system that's broken, and so is trying to work out how they can change that system. An agent of change is someone that actually goes much further in to actually addressing that system. So they might take apart that system and actually address it head on and really make a significant impact on that system.
And what does an inclusive leader look like? You're working with leaders to help them become more inclusive, but what does that person look like who is a true inclusive leader?
It's really interesting because I asked this question. I asked people to tell me who a true inclusive leader is, and they kind of struggle.
Because we default to, like I did in my introduction, of going, oh, well, these organisations are led by women. That's a good thing. And actually, personality-wise, it doesn't actually say anything about how inclusive she may be as a leader. She might be the opposite, potentially. That is no comment on the particular CEOs in question, of course. But yeah, the actual qualities and the behaviours of these leaders, it'd be great to get under the skin of that.
I think an inclusive leader is someone that creates an environment where people can be their true, authentic selves, where there is a level of psychological safety, where they can speak up about how they're feeling, but also speak up about the policies, some of the decisions that are being made without fear of there being any retribution. Those leaders are empathetic. Those leaders are culturally intelligent. So they understand specifically some of the challenges some of their team might be going through, things that are happening in the wider context, and actually how that might impact someone within that context. But also people that are willing to be vulnerable. And that vulnerability doesn't have to, I think people think vulnerability means full disclosure of everything you're doing. It doesn't. I think the skill to vulnerability is understanding what to disclose, what not to disclose. I often talk about losing my brother, but I do it in a context of understanding clearly why I'm doing it. And it's been 11 years, so I have processed it. I don't actually talk about suicide to the same extent and my own personal lived experience around that, simply because I think it probably would trigger me. I haven't totally processed it. So understanding that, I think, is really important. But fundamentally, come back to that vulnerability point. I've stood on stages and talked about the loss of my brother, and that tends to lead to tears. And I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and just thanked me afterwards, because it's actually giving them the courage, the permission to have conversations that they wouldn't normally have themselves, and help them go through their own grieving. I think everyone has their own grief path, but often we do see that some people just shutting it off can be very damaging. For me, just giving that permission, showing that vulnerability so that people feel that they can be open, they can be vulnerable, I think can be super, super powerful. And from my experience, vulnerability is the one that many senior leaders, male senior leaders, struggle with.
Can you remember the first occasion that you spoke about publicly losing your brother and the effect at the time, and when that kind of started to come to light for you, that in you being vulnerable, this was helping the people that you were speaking to go somewhere themselves?
Probably was masculinity in the workplace, being on the stage and doing it to 180 people. I run something called That's Me, That Is in a lot of the work I do with senior leadership. Fundamentally, we ask people to share a story they wouldn't normally share in the workplace. And we do encourage them to be vulnerable. We get them to watch Brené Brown's video. I'll always open it up with my story. I would say that 50% of the people actually change their story or go deeper as a result of hearing me do it. The power that has and the power it creates in that group. I mean, I had one client who That's Me, That Is was so powerful for them as a team. One of the leaders, just 6 weeks later, I said, what's changed? He said, you know what? I can't believe it. He talked about this one specific leader is for the first time he phoned me up, not because of a work issue. He phoned me up because of something he was experiencing and wanted advice. It wasn't a personal, it was about his leadership and stuff. That's never happened before. And so what you start to see is you start to build different types of connections, different types of relationships. And I think that can be so powerful. If I was going to say what are the keys to unlocking inclusion, equity and diversity, it is engaging men, but vulnerability is also the other key. Understanding if you can create vulnerable workplaces where people are truly open and where vulnerability is valued and rewarded. We do a piece of research every year called Masculine to the Workplace. What we found was over 50% of the people, respondents, said that vulnerability was important for inclusive leadership. Only 3% said it was currently valued and rewarded. The scariest stat is that 50% of junior mid-female respondents said that it was dangerous to show vulnerability in the workplace. And that's because they're being judged for it. It's going to negatively impact their career. And that's a huge worry.
That is a big worry. I'd love to just repeat back to you what I heard as the tool there that you did with those leaders, because I was going to ask pragmatically, how do you encourage, these kind of behaviours? So you were doing an exercise where you were going to share a story, all as a group, something that people wouldn't have heard about you before. And then you, by leading by example, immediately sets the tone and sets the example for that conversation. And then there's a much deeper experience that goes on as a result of it. Is that something that you would recommend that leaders would do themselves, or do you think that it is important to do it as part of a break from the day-to-day? Is it a bit risky to do that in the midst of a team meeting or something, The
bit I missed out is we actually get them to send us an image first. They know it's their turn to tell the story because they see the image, okay? And some people get really apprehensive from it. So the need to actually just talk to them, coach them, understand why they're doing it, I think is really important. All the work that I do, we will use tools that we encourage our clients to use. I've had a client do it in a different way that's then inspired us to create a new different type of product. So what I love about that is someone builds on what you're doing, because I love that, but we've just done it differently because the circumstances are different. That's a really lovely idea. We can build a product around that. So for me, my recommendation would always be, yes, do it, but make sure you've had it done first. So you've felt it, you know it. But there are other ways of doing it. So, for example, I run something called the Token Man Brain Trust, which is C-suite leaders who come together. They're committed to inclusion and diversity. I do a session with them every month. And the first thing we actually do is we show them the feelings wheel. So just type it into Google, just type in feelings wheel, and we get them to choose a feeling and we get them to put them into chat. And then we put them into pairs and we get them to talk for 4 to 5 minutes around that feeling. The other person's job is not to try and fix, it's just to listen, it's to be empathetic, to actively listen. The feedback from those men is a lot of the time, some of them might come in for the first time, they're complete strangers. One of them said recently, I've told stuff to one of you that I've only met once before that I've never told to anyone that I've worked with for 10 years. I think it's about creating the right atmosphere, the right setting, and I'm doing this over Zoom, right? This isn't in person. People who say you cannot do feelings over Zoom, you're not using Zoom properly. As long as you create the right space, I'm creating a lot of men-only spaces. The journey we need to take men on is we need to give them the ability to say what they're thinking. And sometimes what they're thinking is wrong. Yeah, it comes from a place of ignorance. If they said that in their workplace, they would get shouted down immediately. They would be judged for it. And therefore, what we're seeing is a lot of men just being silent. There is value in being silent and listening and learning. Going back to your point, Rob, going back when I first spoke on that stage, I had spent a lot of time listening and learning what women were feeling. I was talking about what I'd learned and my journey through doing that. So therefore, it was really important. But that book I talked to you about, the best piece of advice ever, my best piece of advice ever in it is it's better to be wrong and interesting than right and boring. Well, the reason I've taken that is I've learned so much more by being wrong than being right. The challenge that we have in this space is saying the wrong thing in the wrong room can actually be very damaging. So for me, trying to create that, we call them, we're now calling them brave spaces, brave space for the men to make those mistakes means that we can take them on that journey.
I think that's so critical. Got an example from my own life, friend of a friend, very senior, approaching his 60s, and he's very, very senior in a bank. And he told us one, Sunday barbecue that he literally does not speak to anyone at work about anything other than transactional, this piece of work needs doing, and, can I have this? Can I have that? No small talk, no personal life. And it's because of this anxiety that he has about saying the wrong thing, ultimately. That was my assessment of it. That wasn't how he characterized it. He characterized it as, oh, well, they can drag you into HR for saying anything these days, right? This must be the kernel of what you're trying to get to, right? This kind of anxiety that's at the center of a lot of us men in the workplace, right?
Going back to that kind of worry, my experience is actually if your heart's in a really good place, you're working really hard to do it, if you say the wrong thing, the communities tend to be very, very understanding. They'll let you know you've said the wrong thing. They'll do it in a way that's very respectful and will help you go on that journey. Because unless anyone tells you, you're not going to know to change it. My experience has been very positive, but I think that's because my experience hasn't been in a corporate, right? I think the environment has changed now. I do fear for the men that aren't leaning in now to inclusion and diversity. There's a real risk they'll wake up in 5 years' time and find that they're irrelevant and it's too late. The journey takes time. If you're not an inclusive leader in 5 years' time, you just won't be a leader.
I've seen, perhaps privately more than publicly, a lot of opposition to kind of affirmative action and schemes which aim to promote people from underrepresented groups into more senior positions. And I've seen amongst men from kind of the 20s, 30s world who haven't engaged with the kind of work that you're talking about, this fear that they are going to lose out at the expense of someone else being promoted over them. The subtext being, who probably can't do the job as well as me. The classic argument is, well, we should just be purely meritocratic and promote the people who can do the job the best, right? We know the problem with that is everyone who's the best leader in the world can't be a white, straight man, right? There has to be lots of different types of people who can be a good leader and be in a senior position. What do you say to those men who are feeling that fear that they are going to lose out by being an ally, by championing those less privileged in whatever way than them?
I think firstly, we can't just shut down that fear. That's how they're feeling, right? I went into a business recently where the CEO was in the room. It was a group of women. I thought he was brave, but he just did what I call a logic flow. Okay? And his logic flow was this. Listen, I understand I've had the privilege. I've had all the benefits. If you're a graduate coming into our business now, and you're a man, our intake is 70% men, 30% women. Our manager target is 50-50. Within that, who has the better chance of being promoted? He was kind of heckled for it. So that's a really dangerous. He said, I'm just telling you numbers and I'm stating facts. So the reality is in some industries, there will be a level at which you go, do you know what? There might be a rebalancing. But who do you think is going to have more chance of getting that promotion? The person that's leaned into inclusion diversity, who's pulling the right people in, who actually is supporting others, who's vulnerable, is empathetic, is the kind of leader that we need in the future, or the person that just sits there and goes, poor me. The second thing is, I think what people do is we just need to get them to really relook at that reality as well, because often it's just not true. I remember I ran a workshop, some of my favourite workshops I've ever done for a big FMCG for their factories. And we had it was 50 people at a time, so it was big. There's 3 facilitators, 50 people. And just at the beginning of the day, before we started it, we said, are there any elephants in the room? Is there anything that's not being spoken? So this one guy went up and he said, I think women are being promoted who don't deserve to be promoted.
There we go. There it is. He laid it out.
He did. And I just have to say, I'm very proud of my answer. Because I said on the spot, can I just ask you one question first? Before we say anything else, do you think there are some men who are also being promoted that don't deserve to be promoted?
Perfect answer.
He looked around and he went, yes. But I didn't do it to shame him. I just did it just to get him to think about that statement and what that statement actually meant. But what I said to him is, listen, that's how you're feeling. Can we come back to you at the end of the day and ask you the question again? We came back at the end of the day, we asked him and he said, do you still feel that? And he said 100% not. And the reason I tell that story is because what has shifted is we'd given him information that he didn't have before. So we got him to understand why they were doing mixed panels and mixed diversity panels. We've got them to understand why there was a real push to get more women in. Because actually, all of a sudden, he started to see the data that showed that more diverse teams are more effective. When we start to understand the value is diversity, you start to understand that we shouldn't be hiring the best person for the job. We should be hiring the best person for the team. And when you start thinking it from a team level, you start to recognize that bringing someone in as different to everyone else is in itself a huge advantage. It will create such a different dynamic in the team. It will bring different thinking in that actually, so it doesn't matter if that person over there has got a little bit more experience. Actually, this person is bringing a richness. And so you will naturally start to bring in different types of people. You need positive action to make sure those people are in the process, because actually that's really important. But that's not positive discrimination. That's just recognizing actually we need to bring the best person in for the team.
I love that. Don't hire the best person for the job, hire the best person for the team. What does the data tell us about the value of diverse and inclusive teams over their non-inclusive rivals?
I mean, the data that everyone should look at is McKinsey. They've done it 3 times now. They've done over 10,000 companies. They looked at senior leadership teams. They looked at boards. And I can't remember the data totally off the top of my head. They basically compared the top quartile, so the most gender diverse boards, and compared them to the bottom quartile, which is the least gender diverse boards. And what they found is, being in the top quartile, you were 27% more likely to succeed than the big people in the bottom quartile. If you then looked at ethnicity diversity, that then increased to something like 32%. So the numbers are significant. So what I say to most people is just think about your history, think about the teams you've been in, where's been the richest experience. And I think all of them, if they've had that experience, has been within diverse teams. You have such a richer experience, but it doesn't mean it's easy. So we ran something called the Great British Diversity Experiment. It's really where Utopia, which is the business that I used to run, came from, because I ran it with Nadia Powell and some other people within the advertising industry. It was a experiment where we got diverse groups to actually solve a creative idea. So it was so powerful. I think Google supported us and we put all these groups together. We had a facilitator on it. I think it was Tesco and BBH advertising agency, gave actually a brief that they'd been struggling to actually solve themselves. And then we just did a competition, and it was 180 people, and we just got this amazing richness. But what we really found, and this is where we come down to leadership, we actually came up with the mentors. It was really seat of the pants experiment. You know, that idea to have mentors was a last minute decision, but it was such a key decision because it helped us really see the impact, the positive or negative impact mentors can have. So you had basically 3 types of mentors. You had the mentors who facilitated and gave them the space. So they gave them a framework for success. Here's a framework. Here's what can work. We'd love to just check in when you think it will work to check in. So really became this real facilitators to that diverse thinking. The one set of facilitators that just said, didn't give them any framework, just said, I'm here if you need me. That was a disaster. Yeah. And then you had the other one which just said, okay, here's how it's going to go. This is our checkpoints. You're going to give me this date in which you're going to show me your idea. I'm going to tell you whether your idea is good enough. That was a disaster because it wasn't giving them the freedom, but more importantly, they became a gateway to the idea where actually it needs to be that diverse thinking, that diverse group that actually comes up and decides what the best idea is. And so it really got us to start seeing that kernels of what an inclusive leader is. And it's someone that really facilitates and allows people to be their full authentic selves, to actually make mistakes themselves, but at least give them the framework and the support that they need along the way.
So we're going to lift you out of your day-to-day and have a look at the world at large now. So what's a little bit of a radical change that you'd like to see for the world that perhaps you're not influencing on a day-to-day basis with your work?
We so need a radical change in this space. I find it impossible to separate the two, to be honest. I want to see a real shift in the inclusion and diversity space to actually work out how to engage men. You know, the stats that came out in March, which showed that 52% of men in the UK now think gender equality has gone too far and now discriminating against them, is shocking.
That is shocking.
This is not just men. Gen Z, 51% think gender equality has gone too far and discriminating against men. The industry's not talking about this stuff. I think every single event around I&D should be having, if not front and centre, it should be one of the panels. I went to an event, they didn't even touch upon it. They didn't even talk about it. So that's the shift for me, is we have to be talking about this more. And part of this talking about this has to be recognizing that everyone needs some level of support. So when we talk about equity is 100% recognizing that some groups, historically marginalized, need more support than others. And that is just so true. But that doesn't mean not thinking that just because a group is privileged that it doesn't need support. It does need support. So we do need to make sure that men's mental health is on the agenda. We do need to have fatherhood's on the agenda. We do need to make sure that we're doing a lot of that inspiration work, the vulnerability, the culture, intelligence, and we're supporting that. You know, it's interesting. I was talking to someone earlier today about, why there weren't enough men as allies at, I think it was a Black History Month event. I said, well, they're the ones losing out because that event will be so important for their culture intelligence. They need to be in those rooms for that culture intelligence, as opposed to positioning it as allyship. Let's repositioning it as something they need to be at, because actually they're going to be much better at their job, much better at understand their people, supporting their people, rather than saying, oh, this is your job to be a better ally. Actually, this is your job to be a better manager and leader. Let's focus it within that. I don't want to lose the allyship, but let's look at allyship on the kind of systemic level. That's where I'd like to see the shift.
And if there's someone listening to this podcast, and plenty of people do now, it continues to surprise me, but we have lots of lovely listeners. Thank you. Love you all. Someone who's listening to this podcast who has a little bit of a radical idea themselves, maybe something that, in your words, makes them shit themselves. What would your advice be to those people to get started?
It's interesting, isn't it? If I look at my career, people will say to me, I haven't seen people, what are you doing now? I went to an event and someone talked about probes. People said, you do so much stuff. How do you choose what to do? And what I do is I tend to put a lot of ideas out. Even I'm much more focused now around Token Man and Token Man Consulting, but I will still put ideas out there within that space. And I'll put the idea out. So a really good example is Brave Spaces. Someone rightly, I used the word safe space for men, and they talked about, if you look at the historical connotation, I'm not sure that's the right word, safe space. So, and then someone came in, Joshua Weinstein came in and said, well, I've heard a lot of people talking about brave spaces. So I thought, oh, that's such an interesting thing. Let me create a brave space. So I launched a product called Token Man Brave Spaces, put it out there. The first session, I got 11 people, and I said to them, okay, I want you to decide, do I continue with this or not? And they all put their hand up, and I'm continued with it. And sitting here today, on my next session, I've only got 3 people signed up. And if I continue to only have 3 people signed up, I'll do the 3 people. I might not ever do it again publicly. So for me, it's just try and do stuff, even if it's within a small space. You learn so much by doing, but there's so much to be said to just getting an idea out there. Just do something. I just read a post which came through a men's group that I'm in that was written by someone I know really well. He's part of my Authors Anonymous group, which is Sam Conifer-Lende, who wrote the book Be More Pirate. And he wrote this post in our men's group. It was asked, is this performative allyship? And actually, he got his daughter to paint his nails pink because he was going to see Harry Styles. And he was really clear in his post, actually, to say, I was hesitant on writing this post because I'm worried that this will be seen as performative allyship. But what he then talked about is he talked about the conversations that those pink nails opened up over the next week with other men. And I thought that is fascinating because that's interesting. The fact that it's opened up conversations that he wouldn't normally have, we have to applaud that. He's trying to work out, is there something you can do with it? For me, it's about connections, right? So Charlie Craggs, the amazing Charlie Craggs, has the amazing product called Nails Transphobia. She actually delivers free workshops. She will bring nail technicians in. They're all trans, and it gives the opportunity to actually meet and have a discussion with someone who's trans. I'm trying to work out how can we get all of these things work in a kind of interesting way. But I think for him, he just wrote that down and actually as an idea, and then it will see what happens. And I'm seeing a lot of people just sharing their ideas, and actually not being so precious. I think that's the problem a lot of people get, is they hold these ideas, they think they're so precious. There's actually no value in idea. The only value in idea is actually delivering it.
Yes, absolutely. Ideas are cheap. Execution is everything. One of my favourite mantras. Daniele, it's been fantastic to talk to you today. Thank you so much for giving us your time and so many interesting personal stories and thoughts about inclusion, diversity, and being a man in today's world. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.